Okay, I'm going to break this tutorial down into steps that are way easier to follow than you might imagine, so that you can have a go, create this, and amaze yourself. Okay, so as explained in the intro, I'm going to break this down into steps so that not only you learn about the painting process and techniques, but also about the app that I'm using, PROCREATE. But that isn't to say you couldn't use a different app on a different tablet and still follow along. Having said that, within the app PROCREATE, I'm using their default A4 canvas, which is 297 by 210 millimeters at 300 dpi. Or you might also want to take note of the pixel dimensions, which is 3508 by 2480, again at 300 dpi. And then in terms of the color profile, within PROCREATE by default is the code, the sRGB code, the one that ends in 2.1 here on the list. Then also with the brushes, I'm going to be using default brushes that come with the app for free. I'm going to be using within airbrushing, the soft brush, maybe the medium brush. Within elements, I'm going to use the clouds brush. And within organic, I'm going to use the rainforest brush. In terms of the colors, I've already pre-selected a color palette here. And if you go to the value section, you'll notice here we have what we call hexadecimal codes for each color. And I've included the hexadecimal code list down in the video description. So you just need to copy and paste them one at a time into this box and press enter. The color will appear up here. And then you can tap it into a blank color palette and create this for yourself. Or alternatively, next to the codes in the description is a link that will take you to my Patreon page where you can download the color file for free to save you some time. And Patreon is also the place where you can support this channel, as well as access exclusive content such as extended versions of most of these tutorials. I'd like to say a massive thank you to those people who do support me over at Patreon. It really does make a huge difference, so thank you so much. And with all of that said and done, we're going to get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate the canvas to the portrait orientation. And whether you click in and out of the canvas now, you go back to the gallery and then open the project again, it will save it in this configuration. I'm going to go to the colors, first color on the top row, and I'm going to drag it from the color circle into the canvas, release, and it flood fills the whole canvas. And that just gets rid of that really kind of intimidating white background. Next, we're going to go to the second color on the top row. I'm going to go to the brushes, airbrushing, soft brush. I'm going to put the brush size pretty big, maybe about 40% size and 100% opacity. Just zoom out just so you can get it in the top area, about here. And you just want to leave a little bit of that original color we laid down as a background remaining at the top, but not too much of it. Then we're going to go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, and we're going to slide that across and blur it in, and about 40% will do. And it's just created a little bit of a gradient there between that darkest color at the top and then this lighter color. And it's really not a very dark color, but it's just important that we have it going a little bit darker at the top and then a bit lighter. I just need to point out that sometimes the colors will look a little bit different. My camera will throw the colors out a little bit, but as long as you've downloaded the color palette or used the color codes that I've provided, then your colors will be the same as mine. You're probably best comparing your finished image with my finished image. That'll show us a still at the end of the video and compare those. Next, I'm going to go to my layers, maybe keep things on separate layers, just in case we need to adapt or amend things as we go along. So I'm going to click the plus symbol, create a new layer 2, go to our colors, use the third color on the top row. I'm going to stay with a soft brush with an airbrushing, and we're going to put that lower on the size, so probably about 20% size and 100% opacity still. And then about a third of the way down from the top, we'll do a band of this across. We'll go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, and we'll slide this across, blur it in to about the 50%, and then deselect. Again, separate layers, so go to our layers, create a new layer, layer 3, go to the fourth color on the top row, same brush, soft brush with an airbrushing, same size, 20%, still 100% strength, opacity. So we'll aim a little bit lower, almost at the halfway point, but just a little bit up. You'll see a little bit of that orange still remaining even at this stage. Then adjustments, Gaussian blur, blur that in again to about the 50%, deselect. We may well go back to layer 2 actually, slide, duplicate it, and it just brings that level of orange up a little bit more. We're going to go back to the top layer, create a new layer, layer 5. We're going to move along to the 5th colour, still with the soft brush, with an airbrushing, but I'm going to turn it down from 20 to maybe about 15% size and 100% opacity still. Then just towards the lower part of that orange, we'll have this even darker orange. Again, adjustments, Gaussian blur, blur it in, slide across, a little bit less, maybe about 40%, deselect. Go to our layers, create a new layer, layer 6, and we'll also go along to the 6th colour on the top row. Again, same brush, same size, same strength. So 15% size, 100% opacity. And then at the bottom part of the orange, we'll add this colour. Hold it if you've gone a bit wonky. It just puts it to a straight line again. Adjustments, Gaussian blur. Slide that across. A little bit less, maybe about 30%. Go to our layers, create a new layer, layer 7. We'll also go to the 7th colour on the top row. Still the same soft brush, 15% size, 100% opacity. Again, just aim for the bottom area. Hold it until it snaps to a straight line maybe. Adjustments, Gaussian blur. Slide it across, about 30%. Deselect. Go to our layers, create a new layer, 8. Go to the 8th colour. And we are going to put the brush size up a little bit, maybe to the 40%. Put the size of this maybe 50%, 100% opacity, and then just aim for the center of this white area, or maybe the bottom. Fill in the bottom, and if it just needs a little bit, then you can turn it down 20% or so and just go in there and just fine tune that. Again, adjustments, Gaussian blur, blur it in, not so much, 20% will do. New layer, layer 9, 9th colour, soft brush, 30% size, 100% opacity. Let's just get the bottom section. Adjustments, Gaussian blur, blur it in, maybe 50%. Deselect, go to our layers, last layer for the sky, 10th colour, soft brush, 30% size, 100% opacity, and just aim for the bottom. Do a band of this, adjustments, Gaussian blur, and then blur that in again to about 50%. Deselect. Now we've created a really nice kind of gradient for our sky. What we could do perhaps is take all of those layers from layers 2 until 10, and just really to simplify things, we can condense them together. And this allows us to do something quite important, so we can go to the transform and then put it on freeform, pinch it up from the bottom, and then we can just squash together some of those layers if we need to. We're going to think about where the sun is going to be in our scene, so it's not going to be in the dark area and it's not going to be in the lightest area. It's going to be contained in this kind of orange band here. And we don't want it necessarily too broad, so we can control it now at this point. We can make a really narrow section of it if we want. I don't require it to be that narrow, so I think somewhere about here. And then I've just got an extra little bit at the bottom that I need to amend, so I can go to the 10th colour, soft brush, 30% size, 100% opacity, and I can just go over this section just to finalise that. So now we've got a gradient that we've got the ability to work over the top of. So I'm going to go and create a new layer, layer 3. I'm going to zoom in. Now, some of the blurring, some of the different effects will have created some perhaps banding in the sky, and honestly that's not actually a problem for us. It may even be advantageous, so I don't really care about that. What we're going to do is just focus in that top area for now. We're going to go in with the 10th colour on the middle row. I'm going to use the medium brush within airbrushing, maybe put it about 8% size and 100% opacity, and I'm going to aim to put the sun not quite into these purpley areas, but certainly within the centre of the kind of orange section here. So roughly guess where the middle is. Tap it in a few times until you get a really nice sort of strong version of that yellow. Now if I go to the colours, you'll see it's a very washed out yellow, and that's fine. It's almost a yellow-orange, really. Now, it's not going to be vibrant enough on its own, so we're going to use an effect. We're going to go to the adjustments, the bloom. Don't change any settings. We're just going to slide that across all the way, 100%, and it really ramps up the glow. So deselect now, and that sun already looks vibrant in that sky. I'm going to go to our layers again, create a new layer, layer 4, tap on the little N on the layer, change it to the add blend mode. I'm going to go to the fourth color on the bottom row of colors. I'm going to go in with the soft brush, 2% size, 10% strength, and we're just going to do some lines that cut through the center of our sun, and it doesn't have to be particularly neat. Just try to keep it roughly horizontal, and I can go kind of across all the way. And again, it doesn't need to be neat. Maybe just at the top section there, you can do some dashes that don't necessarily join up. Just skim the top of the sun. Keep it a little bit varied, a little bit random, sketched in places. Allow it to bulk up, be bigger shapes even. Tap it in. Then we'll go to the first color on the bottom row. And we'll do some more lines maybe that cut right the way across. Zoom out if you need to. Angle it if you need to, if it's easier to do lines this way. Do it all the way across. Again, this doesn't need to be particularly neat. We're going to go to the smudge tool at the top. Soft brush with an airbrushing still. 4% size, maybe not quite 100% strength, opacity, so put that maybe at 80. And then what we're going to do is just take these lines, skim this across, soften them in. You can even do a little bit of kind of twisting. Make them a little bit rougher, wiggle that line in just to make it a little bit rough, and then other areas perhaps we can just smooth that in. Maybe at the bottom we'll smooth that in a little bit more. And that's a good background layer. Perhaps we'll go and create a new layer. Again, change the N, blend mode to add. Go back to the fourth color on the bottom row. Still with a soft brush. Same settings, 2% size, 10% strength. And then we can just add some more lines here. Lines that cut across the sun. And you get a really nice effect now with the bloom. So any lines that cut through just kind of emphasize that glow on the edge, slightly distort the shape of that sun just at the very edge. We'll just skim it across here. Very top, another line that cuts a little bit lower down as well. And then we could just really go into some of these sections and keep ramping that up. Maybe turn it down even further to lower on the 2%. Stay at the 10% strength. And just go over some of these sections, really bring out and exaggerate some of this light. Doesn't need to be all straight lines or neatness. We can always go in and blur that in, smudge that in. So again, we can go to the smudge, same settings on the soft brush. Actually, no, we'll turn that down to maybe 2%. Stay at the 80% strength, opacity, and just soften that in a little bit so it doesn't look quite so rough. Find any bits where they don't join up perhaps and just circle them in, smudge them in. Perhaps go back in with the brush again, continue the work we were doing. Perhaps just be a little bit more careful. Go in the middle of the areas that are already light and just continue to build them up. Make a really nice bold section here perhaps. Maybe a separate one here. And then, well, we can move over slightly further away and maybe take some angles on these even. Perhaps put it up higher on the 2%. You can have some bits of cloud that just go off at strange angles. Another bulk of cloud over here. Turn it down again. Lower on the 2%, maybe some bits of cloud that are just drifting over this way. And of course we have the smudge, still set to the soft brush, 2% size, 80% strength. And again, we can just use this to further disrupt, bold lines across, just cut through some of that, push it around, even just sort of circle it in, then push it around. You get some disruption of those shapes and lines, and you're getting some really nice kind of effects of clouds. Doesn't take a great deal of skill or effort. Some of the lines seem to be going off at a slight angle, which isn't a big problem. We could always just go to the transform, go to the green at the top, and just rotate that. Make some of those lines a bit more horizontal. Quite easy to fix. You can choose to do that as much as you want. Just tweak that a little bit more if it's gone a bit off. We'll probably come back to the sun area a little bit later. We're going to have to start dealing with the clouds now. So I'm going to actually do this a slightly different approach than I might usually. I'm going to do the really foreground detail first and then work backwards. So we're going to create a new layer, layer 6. We're going to go in with the rainforest brush within organic, and we're going to use the 9th color on the top row. I'm going to put it to 5% size, maybe 80% strength, maybe 80% strength, and I'm going to create a little bit of a kind of dome shape initially, but a few taps as well. We don't want it to be too neat, too obviously that kind of dome shape, but we're going to bear that in mind for all of the clouds that kind of recess back there. But then a few taps just in the lower section as well. We're going to add some highlights here. They're going to be really illuminated by that sun effect. So we'll just concentrate on this really foreground area to begin with. And I'm going to tap on the layer. I'm going to put on the alpha lock. I'm going to go to my colors. I'm going to go maybe to the 4th color on the middle row. So I'm going to stay with the same size brush at 5%, but I'm going to go for a lower opacity, maybe 20%. And because we have the alpha lock on now, we can just skim along the top edge of that cloud. It allows us to be quite loose. Initially, we're just building in a hint of highlight, but then we are definitely going to ramp it up quite significantly as well. But let's do this gradually. So we've got that front edge that is definitely going to catch the sunlight. Then maybe just one or two places it just comes away from that leading edge as well. Got a top section here, especially in the center. The center is where we're going to have the most dramatic highlights. But it isn't to say we don't have any presence of the glow at the edges, because we are. It's just going to be a little bit more in the middle. Maybe turn that down to 3%. And we can just build in a bit more glow. And it's only going to add it. You see, it's impossible for me to add it there. It's only adding it on top of the colors that we've already got in place on that layer. So it's just adding to the effect. We can perhaps go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur. Blur that in, soften it in, maybe to about 10%. Deselect. Back to our colors. Maybe go to the 6th color along. Same again. Concentrate in the center area to begin with, because that's where the most dramatic glow is going to be. That's already starting to really build a nice effect of the sun impact in the cloud there, I think. Quite happy with that as a beginning. Perhaps we'll go to the layer, turn off the alpha lock, go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and just blur that in slightly, maybe about 5%. Deselect. Now what I might do with that whole layer is slide and duplicate it, and that ramps it up as well. That makes it kind of more dramatic. So I'm going to take those two layers, top one, merge down, and on that layer I'm going to slide and duplicate it again. I'm going to take the bottom version, I'm going to go to transform, I'm going to go to freeform. That allows me to move it around underneath that initial layer. I can squash it and go to flip it horizontally. Can maybe put it back here, maybe squash it in a bit more, put it back there, slide and duplicate it again. There's only so many times that you can probably do that with one section of cloud, but I certainly feel I can do it a couple more times. So freeform, stretch it out, maybe I can have it within the distance if I flatten it and squash it. Go back to the lowest version that was there. So we've got 3 layer 6s now, the bottom version again, slide and duplicate it, transform, maybe flip it horizontally again, squash it in. And this is just a way of speeding up the process of building in kind of banks and layers of cloud. Bottom version of layer 6, duplicate. I'm actually going to select the bottom version, move it around, maybe flip it horizontally, flatten it down, put it back here somewhere. And I don't feel we're getting into any too obvious duplications. If we are, we can always go in and just push that around with a smudge, manipulate it if we feel it's a problem. Bottom version of layer 6 is that squashed version, but I'm going to duplicate it. Select the one underneath it. Again, just push that up, maybe flip it horizontally once more. Push it up there. And that's done quite a good job of getting us started at the very least. So what I could do with all those layer 6s now is just pinch them together so that they're on one layer. I mean, you could always experiment with duplicating it. Select the bottom version, transform, flip it horizontally. And it's certainly a speedy way of creating some of these textures, but you're going to have to be a little bit selective and a little bit careful. Maybe I'll, on the freeform, squash that. And also, you have little anomalies that will appear as well, but we have the ability to use the smudge tool just to really blend things in. So maybe somewhere kind of here. And perhaps on that bottom version, I'm going to tap on the N and just turn the strength of it down to maybe 60%. So it's there as an inspiration. It's a starting point and we can add to it. So perhaps I'll take those layer 6s, tap on the top version now and merge down. So we've got all of that on one layer. I'm going to create a new layer above it, layer 7. I'm going to go back in with the rainforest brush. I'm actually going to go to the first color on the middle row. Maybe 2% size, 20% strength. And now we have to put a little bit of time in to kind of make these disparate kind of areas meld together a little bit better. So now we have gaps, have spaces between them, but we can use this cooler kind of highlight to help bring things together a little bit. We've also noticed we've got a little bit of an arc coming here, so it needs a little bit of flattening out across the scene. I'm actually going to put it slightly lower on the 2%, zoom in, and we can use what we've got as inspiration, creating some, as I was explaining before, kind of mound shapes, but want them to kind of merge into each other. We definitely want some of the dark blue foundation color to remain through as well, so we don't want to obliterate that. It'd be very easy just to add so much of this, or these highlight colors, that you don't see that original dark blue. We don't want to get rid of it completely. So we're just going to take the time now to go around the scene, adding some of this, bringing out some of the details in the shadow areas too. Perhaps I'll go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, and soften that in 5%, deselect. And that's done a lot of the work for us. If you notice there are any areas where you've got little anomalies, you can always now go in. So that was on the layer 6, smudge, tool, soft brush with an airbrushing, 2% size, say 50% strength, and you can always just soften anything in that's a little bit of an issue. It's not really a major problem to fix. Again, I'm going to take layers 6 and 7, pinch them together, or if that's a bit tricky, tap on layer 7, then merge down, and all of that's on one layer. I'm going to slide and duplicate it again. Bottom version, transform, squash it down, and I'm going to move it up, squash it down even more, move it up, and that's going to cater for some of the background layers. Perhaps just flip it horizontally, stretch it across, and just judge this. We want to start to encroach some of that cloud up into almost where the sun is, so about there maybe. Now probably for that top edge we need to go in with the eraser, put the eraser to the soft brush, maybe 5% size and something like 30% strength, and then we can just go and soften that top area. We're going to add more highlights certainly, but we don't want some of the dark blue to be interfering there at the top, so just soften that in. It's going to serve as a kind of foundation level for us to build on. And you can see the overall effect is kind of working even without adding really strong highlights, which is what we're going to do now. So I'm going to create a new layer, layer 8, tap on the little N, scroll down to the add blend mode. We're going to go in with the soft brush with an airbrushing. I'm going to use the first color on the bottom row. I'm going to put the size quite low, about 2%, and maybe about 20% strength. I'm going to zoom in, and then in fact even lower on that 2%. When you zoom in you realize that there's quite a range within the two. And we're going to add some shapes here in the background. Might have to do some of this more manually. We've used kind of like duplication and some tools to add these textures in, but now is the point where we're going to do it a bit more manually. We might even want to turn that down to the 1% actually, for the distant areas certainly. Create some more lumps, undulating shapes. They kind of blend in with each other, undulate, weave in and out. You don't necessarily want to completely treat it uniformly. You want some areas perhaps where you're getting like this dark colour still remaining. So don't be too uniform in your application of it. Keep it a little bit kind of random. This is the area where we're going to spend a little bit more time and just do things more manually. And then as we get towards the edges, perhaps we're going to have just that trailing off, just a few touches. We don't want to lose the textures, but we don't want to add the strongest highlights on the whole of the scene. We want it to be sort of more concentrated towards the center. Perhaps we'll go in with a different color for that. But we will certainly want to keep the sense that the highlight spreads far and wide and the textures continue into all areas of the cloud. And as we come further down, we can perhaps exaggerate some of these shapes a little bit more. We are reserving the highlights for the center area, probably the most, make it more dramatic for these. So we're also going to add some in the foreground, although the 1% size is definitely too small for there. So we'll turn it up for closer areas, 2% size, and then just tap it in a little bit. We want it to highlight it, but we don't want to, create a line that goes all the way across. That would be too clumsy. So just tap it in, press lightly, build in some more of this texture with the highlight. Again, just check it. Have them merging together in places. Here's a section, perhaps just really in need of more highlight. Make more of it. Tap it in even. Another shape here. We can exaggerate what's already there. Make more of a mound and then a dip. Again, this undulating shape. And then here, up and down. Make a bit more of a feature. Check it. It's such an important part of the process to keep zooming in and out. And I probably say it a little too often, but it is actually really important that you do that. Easy to get too focused on an area, zoom in too much and then zoom out and realize it isn't working in context. So always keep zooming in and out. I apologize if that makes it a little dizzying when you're watching me, but it is super important that you do that. I'm going to turn it back down, perhaps lower on the 2% at least. Define some of these center shapes a little bit more. Little touches of it, perhaps in the shadow, just little bits of pointing up. Just catch the light sufficiently to bring in that glow. Let's check it. And we got quite a lot of that color. Perhaps I'll turn it up a little bit more. 3%. Now what I recommend doing is going back to perhaps a layer underneath. So we've got layer 6 underneath it, and perhaps go in with the second color on the middle row. And anywhere where we've got a strong glow now, we'll perhaps need to add just a bit more of a warm color. So 2% size, maybe 30% strength or so. And just underneath that glow, add a bit more of this color that's just going to soften in the highlight and the rest of the cloud a little bit more. Doesn't need to be too much of it, but it'd look a bit strange if the highlight is isolated on its own and it doesn't have any softening in at all. So just underneath where the highlight is, for example, here we can add some of this kind of more purple color just to soften it in places. And I'm going to go to the top layer and create a new layer, layer 9, change the blend mode to add again. And we're probably going to go for the second color on the bottom row. Stay with a soft brush, 1% size, 20% strength is plenty. And then I'm just going to ramp it up even more, especially in the center areas. Perhaps turn that down on that 1%, even lower. And again, especially in the center area, just start to add more of the highlights. We can take it all the way, almost up to the actual sun. We'll bring it forwards a little bit, but not too much. create a new layer, change the blend mode to add. Then we're going to use the fourth color on the bottom row. And this is really for when it gets super close to the sun. You need that absolute brightness to really impact on the clouds that I would say are close. Obviously the sun is, a long way away, but in terms of location within the scene, it's relatively close looking to the sun. Down on that 1%. Again, just use this to really ramp up the edges of clouds that are positioned relatively close to the sun in the scene. That's working quite nicely. What I might do on this layer, actually stay on the same layer, I'm going to go to the first colour on the bottom row. On the soft brush, put it up to maybe 40% size, but really low, maybe about 5% strength. It's just tap 4 or 5 times. Maybe bring that down a little bit as well. So it brings some of that glow into that central area. I think that's important. A couple more. Back to the fourth colour, 1% size, 20% strength, and back in there and continue to bring out the brightest colour. We don't want to lose that real bright look. Still on this top layer with the fourth colour, I'm going to go in with this soft brush. I'm going to put it to 15% size, 5% strength, and I'm just going to bring some of that glow down from the sun. Just really emphasize it in this area. I think it's important. A little bit at the top as well, just generally around that area. Really vibrant glow. I'm going to take the top 3 layers, all the ones with the blend mode, so that's layers 8, 9 and 10, pinch them together so they're on one layer. Adjustments, Gaussian blur, zoom in and just blur it in a little bit. Not too much, maybe 3%, and deselect. It just softens it, gives it a nicer kind of fluffier look. Go to layer 6, underneath that, adjustments, Gaussian blur, blur it in, 4%. On that layer 6, underneath, I'm going to go in perhaps with the third colour on the middle row, soft brush, 5% size, maybe 10% strength. I feel like I can just build in a little bit of a softer look in areas. We've got the highlight and we've got some of that initial blue, but I feel like it could just be a little bit softened in places. It's underneath the highlight, so you're not going to interfere with it. We'll just create a nice kind of softer transition between those two areas now, I think, is perhaps needed. In places anyway, we could always turn it down. 3% size for some areas. Just create a little bit of a softer look. I think sometimes in the center, maybe we've got a little bit too much of that dark blue as well, so we can use that just to soften it in a little bit. Perhaps on layer 6, we could go in with something like the Elements Clouds brush, put it on the fourth color on the middle row, 7% size, maybe 30% strength, and we can just use this to, especially in the foreground, just create some bits of texture now that just a little looser, a bit more noticeable in the foreground. Not quite as soft. You're going to notice a little bit almost like a cloud texture is a little bit more granular almost, so to speak, but I don't feel inclined to do too much, just bits. This is something you could endlessly play around with, really make some dramatic undulating shapes if that's what you felt. Back on layer 8, I'm going to go in with the fourth colour on the bottom row with the soft brush with an airbrushing, 3% size, 10% strength, maybe just play around with some of the streaks that run through the sky just to add a bit more texture in those areas where it kind of transitions between the cloud and the sky. Just so it doesn't have such an obvious break, and perhaps it's almost like a continuation of those textures there. Okay, I think I'm going to leave this tutorial here at this point. I hope you've enjoyed following along. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, and I shall see you back here soon. Bye for now.